Responsibility takes one of two forms. On the one hand, it pertains to obligation, and on the other, it pertains to account. This is to say that when one possesses responsibility, it can mean that they have an obligation to do something, or that they have done something that warrants either credit or blame. A usage of the term in the former sense would be to say something along the lines of, he has a responsibility to act in such and such a manner. And a usage of the term in the latter sense would be to say something along the lines of, she is responsible for such and such a turn of events. Understood in this way, responsibility deals with action. To speak coherently of responsibility requires that we presuppose that certain actions can in fact be preferable to others, that there are indeed compelling reasons for choosing a particular course of action over another. The ability to make such a choice is what is called moral agency. A collective is nothing more than an aggregation of individuals. As such, collectives do not act. Rather, whatever actions are observable from the collective are merely the actions of the individuals within that collective. While it may be true that a collection of like-minded individuals can be assembled such that when they act of the same mind, the nature of the action is still an individual one, as each individual of that group has decided to act in this particular manner. As such, seeing as action is firmly situated within the individual, it is quite clear that collectives do not act. And since they do not act, they can possess no moral agency. Since the notion of responsibility rests upon the idea that there are compelling reasons to choose one course of action over another, and since collectives, due to their inability to act, thusly possess an inability to choose, collectives can possess no responsibilities. This is to say that obligation is not situated within the collective, but rather within each individual of which the collective is comprised, and that neither credit nor blame can be logically attributed to a collective, but rather credit and blame can only be coherently attributed to each individual with respect to their own actions. One might object, claiming that the notion of collective responsibilities are merely individual responsibilities that are universally shared by all individual members of a collective. Indeed, such an interpretation of the idea of collective responsibility is one that is not necessarily incompatible with individual responsibility, and it does not require that we presuppose some sort of moral agency vested within the collective itself. This version of collective responsibility can only pertain to obligations, however. It cannot be extended to deal with that for which one can be held to account without violating the principle that we have already established, that one is responsible solely for their own actions. As such, when I address the notion of collective responsibility, I am not merely speaking of obligations that a group of individuals all individually possess. Rather, when I speak of collective responsibility, I am speaking of the notion that individuals are responsible to or for a collective, not by virtue of their own actions, but rather by virtue of the fact that they are considered to be part of that group. With this understanding, let us now begin again. I have established, as a principle, that since one only possesses agency over their own actions, they can only be held responsible for their own actions. Let us consider the implications of the reverse. If one is truly responsible for the actions of others, then we are fully justified in holding the parents of a criminal responsible for his actions. This may sound appealing to some, especially if you completely reject the possibility that truly good parents can raise truly awful children. But if you take into account the fact that the parents of those parents are also responsible by that metric, then we must also conclude that they are to be subject to punishment as well. And why stop there? After all, it takes a village to raise a child, and parents are not the only influences that the wrongdoer was subject to. By this standard, we must also punish every teacher that they interacted with, every peer with whom they shared camaraderie. And what of the influences that all these individuals were subject to? you will find that whatever bounds you set for this arcane responsibility are nothing but arbitrary, and they reach ever outward across the entire cosmos. The logical consequence of this train of reasoning is the damnation of the entirety of mankind. Let us apply the same standard to a more friendly concept. Let us distribute the responsibility for charity. By the same reasoning that we engaged in earlier, we can show that those who are of generous temperament and choose to engage in charity cannot be credited for their actions. Rather, society at large is responsible for creating these people, and as such, if one may blame the whole of society for the bad actions of some, why then is one not therefore capable of crediting all of society with actions that one may deem to be good? Do we not, by doing so, thereby distribute a packet of this credit even to the miserly, since they are a part of the collective? If one cannot be credited for the actions of another, so too is it the case that one cannot be blamed for the actions of another. I contend that it has always been the design of those who peddle the notion of collective responsibility to legitimize both unearned punishments and unearned rewards. Countless injustices have been perpetuated by those who have sought to blame innocents for actions in which they held no part. Whether it was the German National Socialists who blamed the Jewish people for their problems, or whether it was the Soviet Communists who relentlessly persecuted the kulaks out of existence, the fruits of the idea of collective guilt have always been the same. The innocent are punished for perceived wrongs that they in fact had no part in. Have I now committed the same error that I decry by identifying examples of those who have acted upon this principle? No, as I am talking specifically of the people who were involved in those activities. With regard specifically to communism, I understand that not all communists agreed with Stalin's policies, and I do not claim that any who share in this fundamentally abhorrent ideology bear the guilt for atrocities that have been committed in its name. Each person is responsible for their own actions, and therefore the extent of their guilt is determined by such. Someone is not guilty of the horrendous tragedy that was the Gulag Archipelago, merely for believing in communism. This holds true, even if they possess the vile belief that the gulags were a good thing. Justice demands that guilt be portioned according to our actions, and as such, the only thing that one can be guilty of is that which one actually does. One who possesses an evil belief is guilty only of believing evil. And for this there can be no just punishment, as beliefs alone can harm no one but the one who believes. The extent to which our beliefs are contrary to nature is the extent to which nature will punish us. The man who does not believe that he should have to work for a living will suffer and eventually die, unless he can make someone else pay for his error. I contend that the true implications of the idea of collective responsibility are that your life does not belong to you, and that your actions are entirely irrelevant to how you should be treated. That people are nothing but objects to be used and disposed of at whim, and that morality consists in nothing but brute force. Might makes right. Almost nothing could illustrate this notion better than the Christian doctrine of original sin. The biblical narrative teaches that all of mankind has been damned by God for the sin of Adam and Eve. Not only was the punishment for partaking of knowledge death, this punishment was made inheritable, such that all men should die. But this was not the end. The New Testament adds eternal torture to the list of punishments that all of humanity are to be subject to. For the truly Bible-believing Christian, all are, by nature, guilty. For any who would retort that we are damned purely for our own actions, such a response is neither logical nor biblical. There is no fashion in which the actions that we carry out within the span of our finite lives could possibly warrant eternal torture in the lake of fire, and to have a black mark placed upon my soul, not by virtue of my own actions, but rather due to the actions of some supposed forebear, is indeed to be punished for the actions of another. The only means offered by which one is to escape this fate is to bend the knee and submit, to yield all sovereignty over one's own life, and to acknowledge a supposed guilt that is utterly disproportionate to whatever actions one may have taken. Another example of the principle of collective responsibility is to be found within racism. As discussed in a previous video, the notion of collective responsibility has frequently been found useful by racists of all stripes. In truth, the very act of holding an individual responsible for the actions of other individuals who may possess some superficial genetic similarity is an act that assumes that people possess a responsibility to answer for their racial group, somehow. Whenever the state deems certain businesses as being too big to fail, and therefore allocates taxpayer funds to their maintenance, they act as if the incompetence of some is a claim upon the productive labor of others. They reward bad business whilst punishing prudent industriousness. Whenever the state deems that productive members of society must pay for the sustainment of those who produce nothing, they reward sloth and indolence at the price of virtue and excellence. Whenever a mass killer indiscriminately slaughters a crowd of people over some perceived grievance, they operate off of the principle of collective responsibility. When people bleat about how it is society that is to blame whenever a mass killing is perpetrated by a pathetic, fetid, disgusting piece of trash, they offload his guilt upon the rest of us. And when they seek to disarm innocent people, making use of the crimes of the guilty as their excuse, they, like the psycho killers themselves, are seeking to punish innocents for the actions of others. The idea of collective responsibility is evil. So too are those who act in accordance with it. Its sole purpose is to allow some to evade the natural and logical consequences of their own actions by offloading that guilt upon others. Ultimately, they seek to gain unearned rewards whilst imposing undeserved punishments. None of this ought to be taken to mean that we possess no responsibilities or duties at all. Far from it. If we hold sovereignty over our own lives, we bear a responsibility to recognize this sovereignty within others. In truth, all evils that human beings inflict upon one another consist in the violation of personal sovereignty. And if we desire to live in a world in which we are free to live our lives, unmolested by those who seek to rob, rape, enslave, and murder us, then we must be willing to fight for it.